You didn't need a nameplate, no brass plaque, no stitched cushion with reserved written in cursive. It was understood. It was yours. Third pew from the back left side, same seat every Sunday morning, week after week, year after year, and no one else dared sit there. Not because they couldn't, but because they just didn't. Because in churches like ours, everybody knew who belonged where. It started long before you were old enough to remember. Maybe even before you were born. Maybe that pew was where your mom sat when you was a girl swinging her legs and pretending to follow along in the hymnal. Maybe your dad sat there during his awkward teenage years, jacket too small, tie too wide, listening, but not listening. By the time you came around, the spot had already been claimed not by words, but by time. Sunday morning came with its own rhythm. Shoes lined up the night before, hair combed in the kitchen mirror, a scramble for matching socks, a gentle holler to get in the car, the smell of toast still clinging to your shirt. But once you slid into that pew, everything else stopped. The sanctuary swallowed the world. Cool air filtered light through colored glass, and the sound of breath echoing off wood and stone. You could hear your heartbeat in there. You could hear your dad's belt creak as he shifted. You could hear your mom whisper, "Shh," without even opening her mouth. And there you were, sitting in a place that had held you your whole life, even before you understood what it meant. The wood was worn smooth in spots where hands had rested, where elbows had leaned, where knees had pressed in prayer. You traced those grooves with your fingers, wondering whose touch came before yours. Sometimes when you arrived a little late, and someone was almost in your spot, maybe a visitor, maybe someone who hadn't known you, hesitated. Just a beat, a moment of pause at the edge of the aisle, and like clockwork, someone would scoot down, not with complaint, just acknowledgement. They knew, and they moved, because that pew wasn't just a place. It was part of your family's name, your family's rhythm. You sat there through sermons that felt like hours. You sat there when your legs were too short to reach the floor. You sat there during weddings, funerals, homecomings, baptisms. You watched seasons change through the windows above. Summer light turned everything golden. Winter pressed its cold against the glass like it wanted in. And yet inside that pew, things felt constant. That pew knew you. It knew how your dad cleared his throat before the second hymn. It knew how your mom folded her hands just before the benediction. It knew when you leaned forward, when you got drowsy, when you scribbled in the back of the bulletin, just to stay awake. And over time, you began to feel it. This wasn't just where you sat. It was where you became. Not in any loud, grand way, but in the slow accumulation of Sundays, in the ritual of showing up, sliding in and sitting close to the people who knew you best. And the truth is, you never questioned it. You never asked, why this pew? Because your body already knew the answer. Because it was home. Sunday morning didn't start at church. It started at home. Long before the pew, long before the choir, it began in bedrooms with blinds still closed and hallways still dark. And no matter how many times it happened, it always felt a little different than the other days. A little quieter, a little slower, a little more sacred. You didn't wake up to alarms, not like now. You woke up to the sound of the stove, clicking onto bacon, popping in the pan to the distant clink of coffee cups in the kitchen. Maybe your mother was already humming a hymn under her breath. Maybe your dad was in his white undershirt, carefully shaving by the mirror, the radio murmuring the local gospel hour in the background. You knew what to wear because it wasn't a choice. The church clothes had been laid out the night before, or at least mentally selected by someone older and wiser. The slacks that itched, the shoes that needed polish, the little dress with the tight collar that made you feel like someone's doll. And yet somehow, when it all came together, you looked in the mirror and knew this is how we show respect. It wasn't vanity, it was reverence. Reverence for the day, for the gathering, for something bigger than yourself. And before long, the house moved in rhythm. Someone brushing hair, someone tying a tie, someone burning the toast and swearing quietly because not today, of all days. Someone searching the junk drawer for the collection envelope that had mysteriously gone missing again. You remember how the steam fogged up the bathroom mirror, how the kitchen smelled like hairspray and pancake syrup and a little bit of last night's leftovers reheated for breakfast. It was all part of it, not chaos, not routine, something in between, something you only saw in families that had done this for decades. And then came the lineup at the front door, shoes tied, collars checked, Bibles in hand unless you were young enough that someone carried yours for you. You stood in a row while Mom gave one last glance over licking her thumb and smoothing a wild cow lick. She always caught it. Always. Even when you thought you'd hidden it just right. And your father. He was already in the car engine, idling hands on the wheel like a general, waiting on his troops. The garage door open, the old station wagon humming. Windows rolled down just enough to let the morning in. No one asked where you were going. It was Sunday. You knew. You pulled out of the driveway slowly, waved at neighbors doing the same, drove past kids on bikes and old folks already walking toward the chapel with their jackets buttoned tight. You remember watching the trees go by the sky, changing color, the sun climbing just high enough to light the tops of the church windows. And inside, the car, silence. Not tense, not awkward, just full. The kind of quiet you get when everyone is thinking the same thing, and no one needs to say it out loud. This was your Sunday. And getting ready. It wasn't just about clothes and combs and coffee. It was your family's first prayer of the day. You didn't run. Not here. Not up those steps. Even as a kid. You felt it. Something different in the air. Something slower, older, steadier. The church wasn't grand, not like the cathedrals you'd see in movies, but it stood like it had always been there, like it would always be there. Brick or white wood with paint peeling just slightly around the windows and bushes that someone's aunt trimmed every spring. But it was the steps that signaled the shift, wooden creaking worn down in the middle by decades of feet, of Sunday shoes and high heels of little scuffed sneakers and polished leather. You knew which step gave the loudest groan, which one dipped slightly to the right. Even now you can hear it in your mind. That long, slow hunk of old wood beneath familiar weight. It didn't need fixing. It was part of the place. You held the railing. Or someone held your hand. And when you reached the top, the heavy front doors loomed dark wood, cool metal handle, always just a little bit stiff to pull. You needed both hands as a kid, one to tug, one to brace yourself against the frame, and the moment it opened, the smell. cool air tinged with dust and lemon oil, the faint sweetness of faded hymnals, a hint of someone's perfume, and always that underlying, indescribable smell of time. You couldn't bottle it, couldn't name it, but it lived only here. It clung to the carpet, to the pew cushions, to the air itself, as if every prayer ever whispered still lingered just enough to leave a trace. Inside it was quieter than the world outside, but not silent. You could hear the shuffling of jackets, the murmured hellos, the tap of heels on tile, pages turning, children being gently hushed, and above it all the occasional distant call of someone's laughter, low and knowing like old friends, nodding across decades. The light was different, too, filtered through stained glass in colors that didn't exist anywhere else. It painted your skin with purple and gold, cast blue onto the white collars of the men sitting near the aisle. You'd sit down, and before anything even began, the sunlight had already told you something sacred was happening. The walls were high, the ceiling arched, and even if the building was small, it felt vast, like you were tiny and held at the same time, like the room breathed with you. And when you finally slid into your pew, third from the back left side, it was like stepping into a pocket of time. The outside world shut its door. No homework, no bills, no chores or grocery lists or broken dishwashers. Just the hush, the hymns, and the people beside you. You looked around. The same faces, the same nods, the same cardigan worn every winter by the woman in front. The man who always cleared his throat during prayer. The child who always turned around to stare at you, wide-eyed and unblinking. The familiarity didn't bore you. It steadied you. Because in a world where so much changed, these steps, this door, this room didn't. And deep down, you knew this isn't just a building. It's a memory that remembers me back. You didn't fidget. You didn't slouch. You didn't ask how much longer, not unless you were looking for trouble. Church wasn't the place for running or yawning with your mouth wide open. And even if you couldn't quote the 10 Commandments word for word, you knew there was at least one unspoken rule. Sit still. Stay quiet. Pay attention, even if you're not sure what to. As a kid, you didn't understand most of the sermon. The words were long, the stories were old. The names in the Bible felt like riddles, but you sat and watched and listened with your whole body. You watched your mom's hands, how they folded during prayer, how they gently flipped the bulletin, how they rubbed the back of your neck when you leaned into her shoulder. You watched your dad, stoic upright, nodding slightly when something struck him just right. He didn't say much after service, but his stillness was its own kind of reverence. You watched the pastor not just for what he said, but how he said it. The pause before a scripture, the way his voice dropped low when it was about pain, then soared like a hymn when it was about hope. Sometimes you didn't catch the meaning, but you caught the music of it. The rhythm of words meant to lift something inside you, even if you didn't yet know what needed lifting. And all around you, the choreography of quiet played out, pages turning in unison. A cough held too long. A baby's gurgle from 3 rows up. A tissue passed silently from one hand to another. A peppermint unwrapped as slowly as humanly possible. You counted beams in the ceiling. You traced cracks in the wall. You read the same verse printed on the back of the program 10 times over, then started counting how many words ended in ion. But you weren't bored. Not really. You were learning how to be present without being loud, how to sit with others without needing to speak, how to feel something sacred without needing to explain it. Some weeks, the pew felt too long. Your legs dangled, your back hurt, but you stayed because everyone else did, and you knew even as a child that this wasn't a place for leaving early. You stayed until the last hymn, until the benediction, until the pastor gave that one final nod, and people began to stir, gently, respectfully, like waking from a long dream. And the truth is, you heard more than you think, not just in words, but in the sigh your grandmother made after communion, in the way your older brother leaned forward during the Lord's Prayer, in the tears you pretended not to see when someone sang the solo their husband used to sing. Church wasn't a place you had to listen. It was a place you couldn't help but listen, even in stillness, especially in stillness. And long before you had the words to describe faith, you had this a pew, a silence, and the growing awareness that something bigger than you was happening, and somehow you were part of it. You remember the hymnals, those worn, faded books that lived in the wooden slots just beneath every pew. They were never new, never pristine. Their covers were creased, the corners bent and softened by the touch of countless hands over the years. Some had pages barely clinging to the spine, held together by sheer habit, and a few had names written on the inside cover, usually in pencil, always in the neat, blocky handwriting of a child who wanted to claim it, as if this book belonged to them forever. Maybe that child was still in town. Maybe they were gone, but their mark remained, just like the songs inside. On Sunday mornings, once the preacher had made his opening remarks, and the music leader stood tall beside the pulpit, you knew what was coming. There was a rhythm to it all. Without being told, without a single whisper, hands began to move, reaching forward, reaching down, brushing softly against wood as the hymnals were retrieved, one by one. They were passed quietly down the row from father to son, from sister to brother, from grandmother to you. And when one reached your lap, it always felt like more than a book. It felt like a connection, like something sacred was being handed to you, not just paper and ink, but memory, reverence, continuity. You flipped to the right number automatically. Even before the music began, your fingers had found the page. You'd sung that hymn 100 times before, maybe more. But it didn't matter. The words were familiar, and the melody lived somewhere deep in your chest, waiting to be woken up. Then came the first sound from the organ, deep and wide, like the earth itself taking a breath, and everyone stood. No announcement, no cue, just motion, practiced and quiet. Shoes scuffed gently against the tile. Pages rustled as 100 hymnals opened in near unison. If you didn't have your own, you leaned in beside someone who did. You shared the book, and more than that, you shared the moment. And then you sang, not perfectly, not professionally, but together. No one in that room was worried about being on key. No one cared who sang loud or soft, high or low. You sang because it was time to sing, because the people beside you were singing, because something about those old notes and those old words made you feel steady, rooted, known. You can still hear your mother's voice beside you, sweet and clear, always just a little shaky on the high parts, but never backing down from them. She'd glance at you out of the corner of her eye when she hit a note just right. and you'd both smile without turning your heads. Your dad's voice, low and gravelly, always a half-second behind the rest, filled in the spaces no one else could. And your younger sibling, too little to read the words, made them up as they went mumbling confidently through the verses, only chiming in strong on the chorus they'd finally memorized. Sometimes you'd look around and catch the quiet beauty of it all. The older woman in the front row mouthing every word with her eyes closed. The man 3 pews ahead of you wiping at his cheek without drawing attention. The family behind you with 4 kids each, trying their best, some succeeding, some not, but all present. And for those few minutes as voices rose and blended and lifted, something unspoken happened in that room. A soft kind of unity, a gentle binding of hearts. You were all different stories, worries, wounds, but for the length of a single hymn, you were one. And not because you sang perfectly, but because you sang together. When the final verse faded into the air, lingering like a ribbon unraveling in slow motion, no one clapped, no one cheered. You simply lowered the book, closed it carefully, and passed it back down the row. One hand to the next, a small gesture that said, "We've done this together. Now let it rest." And when you tucked the hymnal back into its little wooden pocket beneath the pew, you didn't think of it as storage. You thought of it as laying something down with care, like tucking in a memory, folding it up, neatly placing it somewhere safe for next time. Even now, all these years later, if you hear that tune somewhere unexpected, on a scratchy old record in a movie, or even hummed faintly by someone in line at the grocery store, it stops you. For a second, your breath catches, not because of the music, but because of where it takes you. Back to that pew, back to that book in your hands, back to the voices beside you, some still here, some long gone. Back to that single ordinary Sunday morning where you opened your mouth and found something waiting to rise from your chest. And the most surprising part, it still fits. The melody still lives there. The words come back like they never left. And for just a moment, the years melt away, and you are once again standing between your parents, holding a hymnal in your hands, singing your way home. You didn't understand every sermon, not at first. The pastor's voice carried through the room like a tide, sometimes rising, sometimes settling, sometimes pausing, just long enough to make you look up from the pattern in the carpet. He had a way of talking that made the whole room lean forward a little, like even the pews themselves were trying to listen. And yet what you remember most wasn't the theology. It wasn't the scripture reference or the quote from some long-gone commentator. What you remember was the way he looked at people, directly, kindly, like he was talking to them, not at them. Sometimes when he paused between sentences, you'd swear he was looking straight at your dad. Other times his eyes would soften just a touch when they landed on your mom, like he knew she was carrying something heavy that week. Because he did know. He knew your family. Not just your names, but your rhythm, your seat, your presence. He knew when you were missing. He noticed when you came in quieter than usual. He could tell when something was different, even if no one said a word. That was the kind of church this was. Small enough to see, steady enough to notice, warm enough to care. You watched your father during those sermons. He didn't nod much. He didn't raise a hand or offer a loud amen. But he listened. carefully, his hands folded in his lap, his brow pulled slightly in like he was holding the words and turning them over inside. You could tell when something struck him. He'd shift just a little. He'd clear his throat gently, and when the sermon ended, he'd walk out quietly, the same man, but also a little more filled than before. Your mother, you didn't look up often. She kept her eyes down, hands laced together, sometimes gripping the edge of her Bible like it anchored her. And every now and then when the pastor spoke about something that touched on loss or fear or waiting, she'd blink slowly, swallow hard, and breathe deep, like someone who was letting something go. And then there was you. You didn't mean to pay attention, but you did. Maybe it was the way the pastor told stories about people from long ago who felt strangely familiar. Maybe it was how his voice would lower just enough to make everyone lean in, then rise like sunlight through stained glass when he reached the part about hope. Whatever it was, it stuck with you. And long after the service ended, long after the potluck dishes were cleared and the parking lot emptied, certain phrases would come back to you. Not the whole message, just a line or two, a sentence that sat in your chest for days without asking for permission. One time he said God doesn't always answer loud, but he never stops listening. And for some reason that line stayed with you for weeks. Sometimes you wondered how he knew what to say, how he could speak to 100 people and make each one feel like it was meant just for them. How he could speak into a silence you didn't know you were carrying and fill it with something that felt like comfort. And then after the final prayer, when everyone stood and the music swelled again, he'd walk down the center aisle slowly. He didn't rush. He didn't hide behind a robe or script. He stopped at pews, shook hands, asked about your sister's cold or your uncle's job. He didn't just preach. He remembered. Even now, you can still picture the way he glanced down your row. Not to check attendance, but to say in his own quiet way, I see you. I know you're here. And I'm glad you came. And somehow, that meant just as much as the sermon itself. You knew where everyone sat. Not just your family, but everyone. Mr. and Mrs. Collins always took the third row on the right, just beneath the stained glass panel of the angel with golden wings. The Jenkins family with their 7 kids, 3 hymnals and 1 perpetually leaky sippy cup, claimed a middle pew like clockwork, spreading out like a picnic blanket that had known the same patch of grass for years. Old Mr. Haywood occupied the far back corner, against the wall near the exit. You never not once saw another soul attempt to sit there. There were no name tags, no signs that said, reserved, no one standing guard with a clipboard. And yet these seats were spoken for, not by words, but by history, by time, by presence. Sunday after Sunday, the ritual unfolded. The doors creaked open. A warm gust of perfume and aftershave drifted in, and the faithful filtered in, not with haste, not with flash, but with quiet certainty. They greeted each other with nods, quiet mornin', and shoulder squeezes, and then like dancers in an old waltz, they moved to their spots, unthinking, unwavering. The pews welcomed them as they had for decades. No reassignment, no confusion, just home. You never thought much of it as a kid. It just was. You showed up. You slid into your family's spot, third from the back left side, and never thought to sit anywhere else. It wasn't habit. It wasn't superstition. It was belonging. Then one Sunday, something small happened that made the whole room feel just slightly off. A couple you didn't recognize walked in just ahead of your family. They smiled nervously, their hands clasped, scanning the rows like travelers arriving at a strange train station. And then they did it. They sat down, in your pew, third from the back, left side, your seat, your parents' seat. The spot where your mother always folded her hands, where your father crossed one ankle over the other, where you leaned your head against your brother's shoulder when you were too tired to sing the closing hymn. And they sat there. No one said anything. Of course not. You weren't raised like that. Your parents didn't believe in confrontation, especially not under a stained glass roof. But there was a moment, a pause in the movement, a soft silence that passed through the room like a ripple in still water. Your father blinked slowly. Your mother glanced at the pew, then at the one behind it. A subtle shrug. The family adjusted. You all took the row behind instead, your knees bumping against the seat that wasn't quite yours. It wasn't wrong. It wasn't a problem. But it wasn't right either. Because the truth is, those pews held more than people. They held years of habits, sighs, and unspoken prayers. They held whispered arguments and soft reconciliations. They held Sunday best coats, folded just so, bulletins tucked into Bibles and hymnals, passed from one hand to another without needing to speak. They held space for stories. That spot where you once fell asleep on your mother's shoulder during a thunderstorm communion. That edge of the bench where your father braced himself when the pastor mentioned layoffs. The exact slant of light across your lap every spring when the sun returned just a little earlier through the stained glass. You didn't own the pew, but it knew you. And your family wasn't the only one. Every family had their place. The Walkers sat by the center aisle, so their elderly aunt could steady herself with the pew ahead. The Harrisons always left the far end open for latecomers, just in case their son, long estranged, ever walked through the doors again. The elderly woman 2 rows ahead never brought a Bible, but clutched her late husband's worn copy every week like armor. If someone wasn't there, if a pew sat oddly empty, it was noticed, not aloud, but in glances, in the hush that filled its absence. Sometimes someone would whisper, "Where's Joe today?" Sometimes no one had to ask. Sometimes people left space without being told. You began to understand that this wasn't about where people liked to sit. It was about where they chose to return. Again and again, week after week, in joy, in grief, in doubt, in habit. It was a form of trust, and you started noticing the smallest things. How Mrs. Peters always carried butterscotch in her pocket and gave you one if you looked too fidgety. How Mr. Langley never sang, but mouthed every word with reverence. How the couple near the organ held hands the entire sermon, even when the message was difficult. These weren't just people sitting in pews. They were living history, and the wood beneath them had been shaped by their presence. You'd see 3 generations lined in a row, a grandfather dozing lightly, his son leaning forward intently, and a grandson drawing quietly on the back of a bulletin. All of them fitting physically, emotionally into the same space as if they had been carved there. And you'd wonder, will I be the one in this pew someday? Will I sit in this exact spot, gray-haired and quiet, watching the next row of children come in with church shoes too tight and questions too big? It was strange to think of a place so ordinary, a bench, A plank of wood, a curve in the sanctuary as something sacred. But it was, because when people return to the same place to feel seen, to feel safe, to feel part of something older than themselves, what else could you call it but holy? And so when that unfamiliar couple stood and left, after the closing hymn, you didn't rush back to reclaim your spot. You waited. You walked slowly. And when you passed the pew, you looked at it not as property lost, but as a friend patiently waiting. You'd be back. That pew knew. And somehow, so did you. It wasn't always joy that brought you to that pew. Some Sundays you walked in a little slower. The light through the stained glass felt dimmer. The air a little thicker. You didn't speak much. You just slipped into your place, folded your hands, and let the quiet carry you. Because that pew, your pew, had held you in every season. It had seen you dressed in your Easter best, grinning with jelly beans in your pocket. It had seen your muddy shoes after a rainy week and your squirming impatience during long summer sermons. And then one day it saw you carry something different. Grief. At first it came in little pieces. An empty seat beside you. A hand missing during the Lord's Prayer. A voice gone from the hymn that used to ring out proudly in your ear. The first time you sat alone, you thought the whole church could hear the ache in your chest. But no one stared. No one asked questions they already knew the answers to. They just noticed. A gentle touch on your shoulder. A bulletin passed with both hands. Someone who usually sat 3 rows up, choosing just this once to sit right beside you. You never forgot how the pew felt that day. It was the same shape, same wood, same squeaky spot when you shifted your weight. But somehow it felt deeper, like it knew what it was doing, like it had been here before for others, like it understood that it now needed to hold a little more than your body. It needed to hold your sorrow, too. And it did. The pastor's voice wove through the room, gentle and careful, landing softly in the corners where the grief sat thickest. The music came, and your lips didn't move. But the song filled the air anyway. You couldn't sing that morning, but others did, and they carried it for you. That's the thing about grief in a church pew. It doesn't ask for a performance. It asks for presence. You showed up. You sat down. You let the space remember for you. There were Sundays after the hospital stay. Sundays after the funeral. Sundays where the world outside felt too sharp, too fast, too loud. And so you came here to this place where stillness lived. Where you didn't have to explain yourself. Where no one asked why your eyes were red, or why your hands trembled when the offering plate passed. Because they knew. Because they'd been there. Because someday they would be again. You saw it on others' faces, too. The mother who wore her daughter's necklace every week, fingers brushing it like a ritual. The man who now came alone, folding his coat neatly where she used to sit, as if still saving her place. The teen who bowed his head too low during prayer hands, clenched like he was holding back something loud. The pews didn't creak in protest. They just held it all. Week after week. Year after year. And in that simple act of sitting down again, of breathing, in the same air of hearing, the same scriptures read aloud, you felt something shift. Not healing, not yet, but space. Space to grieve without being fixed. Space to remember without unraveling. Space to still belong, even if everything else in your life had changed. Sometimes someone would sit down next to you and not say a word. They'd just be there. And in that silence, something inside you rested. Other times, a hymn would begin, one you hadn't heard since before the loss, and your throat would tighten. You couldn't sing, but the voices around you would rise, and somehow that was enough. Even now, years later, you sometimes catch yourself glancing at the spot beside you, expecting a nod, a smile, a whisper, but it stays empty. And somehow, that's okay. Because grief didn't drive you away from that pew. It made you part of it in a new way. You became one of the names people whispered about with compassion. One of the faces they looked for, quietly relieved to see you still showing up. You became part of the rhythm of people who had lost, who had hurt, but who still came, still sat, still believed that presence matters. That pew doesn't ask you to be over it. It just welcomes you back exactly as you are. And on the Sundays when your heart feels heavy again, and it does from time to time, you return. You sit. You breathe. You let your grief settle beside you like an old friend. And you remember that some places aren't meant to fix you. They're meant to hold you while you heal. And your pew, it's been holding people like that for generations. Now it holds you too. It didn't happen with fanfare. There was no announcement, no whisper through the congregation that reached your ear before the service began. No black ribbon on the door, just absence. One Sunday morning you looked over and the seat was empty. At first your mind offered excuses. Maybe they were late. Maybe they had taken a week off. Maybe they'd decided to sit somewhere different, though you couldn't recall a single time in all your years that they had. You kept glancing sideways through the first hymn. Your eyes flicked back again during the scripture reading. But the space stayed quiet, undisturbed, and suddenly that single spot on the pew, usually filled by a familiar jacket, a strong hand, a humming voice, felt louder in its silence than any sermon could. You didn't ask out loud, no one did, but everyone knew. Everyone felt it. Because when someone has been showing up, week after week, year after year, and then they simply don't, it leaves a space. Not just on the pew, but in the rhythm of the room, in the breath of the prayers, in the music of the hymns. Even the air felt thinner without them in it. You didn't realize how much a person shaped a space until they were no longer in it. And for the rest of the service, your attention drifted, not to the message, not to the music, but to memory. You started seeing them as they had always been, walking up the aisle, nodding kindly, flipping through the hymnal with fingers that trembled only slightly in the later years. You remembered their laugh, their gentle way of making room when you scooted in late, the candy they always kept in their coat pocket just in case. And as your eyes lingered on that empty space, something quiet broke inside you. Not the kind of breaking that shatters, the kind that softens. Because grief in a place like this doesn't come all at once. It comes in small waves, in subtle absences, in the realization that someone who used to fill the silence now is the silence. Later, someone might mention it in passing. "Did you hear about Tom?" they'd say. And you'd nod like you already knew, because in your heart, you did. And then the next week, the pew was still empty. No one rushed to fill it. No one made a move. People simply sat a little differently, a little more carefully. as if the wood itself still held the shape of the person who once warmed that spot with their presence, as if sitting there too soon might disturb something sacred. You realized over time that this is how community grieves, not with loud mourning, but with quiet rearrangement, with gentle awareness, with space. Some people would eventually shift over, not to take a place, but to keep it from growing too cold. Others would leave that seat empty a little longer, as if holding a vigil not just for the person, but for the memories left behind. And you sat in your usual spot and tried not to look at the gap too often, but your eyes kept drifting there anyway, because habit is a stubborn thing. And love, even the quiet kind that lives in shared pews and nods across the aisle, doesn't vanish just because someone no longer walks through the door. Sometimes during the benediction, you swore you could still feel them there, not in a ghostly way, but in a way that made the space feel held, as if their spirit had pressed so deeply into the fabric of the place it would take more than absence to erase it. And then there were the little moments, the ones that caught you off guard. When the pastor said something they used to nod at. When the hymn they loved returned after weeks of absence. When someone else sat a little too close to their usual spot, and your heart flinched without warning. You began to notice how others carried their losses too. Quietly, a hand over a heart when a certain verse was sung, a glance at a pew that used to hold more than it now did, a slight hesitation before sitting down, as if waiting for permission from memory itself. And slowly, without ever really being planned, those who remained began to fill the empty space with something else, not replacement, not forgetfulness, but presence. You brought their favorite dessert to the potluck. You quoted their joke during coffee hour. You found yourself echoing their phrasing in a small group prayer. They were gone, but not lost. Not here, but not erased. That pew, it still holds their shape, and maybe it always will, because what they gave to that space wasn't just attendance. It was part of themselves, their warmth, their listening, their faith, and the pew, faithful as ever, still remembers. So you sit, you glance to your side, and though the space is quieter now, you feel them somehow in the stillness. That's the kind of memory a wooden pew can carry. That's the kind of grief that doesn't empty. It deepens. And deep down, you know someday someone will glance at your spot and pause and remember. Not every Sunday, not with the same people, not always at the same time, but every once in a while when the ache is soft and the memory gentle, you find yourself walking back through those same old doors. The hinges still creak. The air still smells faintly of lemon polish and thyme. The same soft shuffle of shoes on tile. The same warm hum of whispers rising and falling like a tide in the narthex. You nod to faces you remember, and some you don't. But no one needs to ask why you're here. They just smile. That quiet church kind of smile. The one that says, "I'm glad you came back." You step into the sanctuary, and the light through the stained glass still dances the same way across the floor. You pause for a second longer this time, taking in the way the morning glows through the reds and golds. Then, without even thinking, your feet take you to where you've always gone. Third pew from the back left side. The place you used to sit every week. The place that still feels like yours. It's not always empty. Sometimes someone's there, and that's okay. You don't need the whole pew. You just need a piece of it, a corner, a sliver of wood that remembers the shape of your hand, a patch of cushion that still dips where you used to sit. You settle in, you fold your hands, and the pew receives you, like it always has. The room is quieter now. Or maybe you are. You don't fidget anymore. You don't glance around, counting ceiling beams or tracing patterns in the carpet. You just listen to the hymn you've sung 100 times, to the preacher's voice, different now but still familiar, to the breath of the room rising and falling around you, and you let your memories take their place beside you. You remember your mom humming softly next to you, her perfume clinging faintly to the lace collar of her dress. Your dad's quiet strength beside you, his thumb brushing the edge of the bulletin as he read. Your siblings leaning too close, trying not to laugh at something whispered behind a cupped hand. You remember the silence after the last hymn, when no one quite wanted to stand yet. The creak of old wood, the crackle of pages being closed, the breath everyone held for just a second longer. You remember it all. And for a moment it's not remembering, it's living. And maybe that's why you still come back. Not to reclaim a seat, not to repeat old rituals, but to sit in a place that remembers you as you were and welcomes you as you are. You stay through the benediction. You stand when the room stands. You nod to the usher with the gentle eyes who's probably new, but feels like he's always been there. And when you step out into the light again, you feel something loosen inside. Something unknots. Something long and old exhales. You don't need to explain it. Not to anyone else. Maybe not even to yourself. Because some pews hold more than people. They hold pieces of lives, fragments of songs, echoes of prayers, and the quiet, enduring truth that you were here. And sometimes that's all you need. Just to sit, to be remembered, and to know without fanfare, without words, that this place, this pew, still remembers you too. And now, as the final notes of memory fade into stillness, you sit just a little longer, breathing in that quiet comfort only time can build. You don't need answers. You don't need anyone to say it mattered. You already know. Because what held you in that pew wasn't just tradition or belief or duty. It was the simple, sacred rhythm of being part of something steady, of sharing space with people who didn't need to speak in order to see you, of letting the seasons come and go while the wood beneath your hands stayed warm with years of presence. And when you rise to leave, you do so gently. You press your palm one last time against the back of the pew, like a thank you, like a promise, like a way of saying, I remember. You step into the light again. The world hasn't paused for you. The cars hum, the breeze rustles the trees. But inside something is quieter now. Something is softer. Maybe it's the reminder that we don't always need more. Sometimes we just need something old, something steady, something that holds us when we forget how to hold ourselves. And so tonight, as your head touches the pillow and the dark wraps gently around your thoughts, I hope a little piece of that pew finds you. That quiet wood, that familiar air, that welcome that asks for nothing, except that you show up. Sleep well. You're remembered.